Hi everybody, my name is Bryony Kingsland. I'm the UK Funding Manager at City and Guilds. We thought we'd provide you with an update today on the apprenticeships and funding because there's been a lot of information coming out over the last 6 months about apprenticeships, but some particularly important information was published at the beginning of February about funding, and it was the funding rules, the final, well, they say the final versions, but it could be the final version, there could be a version 2 of the final version, but at the moment what was published at the beginning of February were the final versions of the apprenticeship funding rules that will come into play from 1st of May 2017 when the new apprenticeship arrangements start. So those funding rules were the final version of the draft rules that were published in October last year, and there are actually some differences between the draft documents that were published in October and the final funding rules which were published in early February. So we thought we'd do a quick 15 or 20 minute update just to take you through what those changes are so that you're aware of the changes, and hopefully it will help you be more successful when you're running your apprenticeships later on this year. So what were the changes? Well, first of all, there were 3 documents published. There was funding rules for providers, funding rules for employer providers, and funding rules for employers. But within those 3 documents, there are core rules which apply whether you're an employer provider, whether you're a provider, or whether you're actually just an employer. So what were the changes? Well, the first thing that was changed was the comments and the expansion of information about what an apprenticeship actually is. And it's very clear in the document that apprenticeship must be a job with a genuine skills development programme, and it must be the length and time of the employment must make sure that the apprentice is able to achieve their apprenticeship within the time of their employment. So it's very clear about what an apprenticeship is, that it's a skills development programme as part of a job, and it can't just be an apprentice taking a qualification to confirm their skills. They've got to develop new skills, and there must be progress in that job as part of that learning and development. So what other information did they change in the new funding rules in comparison to the draft funding rules? The other information they expanded was the evidence for off-the-job training. And what they basically talked about was that both employers and providers must ensure that they have evidence that 20% of the apprenticeship is delivered as off-the-job training, and that's training that doesn't occur when the apprentice is working. So that evidence or that off-the-job training can take place as part of online learning that's done in the workplace or as a provider. It can take place as day release, it can take place as block release, it can take place on the provider premises, or it can take place on the employer premises, but you must have the evidence to prove that off-the-job training is taking place as part of that apprenticeship, and that evidence will be audited by either the Institute for Apprenticeships or by the Skills Funding Agency. So off-the-job training can include all sorts of different ways for delivery. It can include teaching of theory, for example, lectures, role-playing, simulation exercises, online learning, manufacturer training. It can include practical shadowing, mentoring. It can include industry visits. It can also include stuff like assignments and learning support. But it's got to be training that doesn't occur when the apprentice is working. So the other changes that were within the new funding rules, the final document, was about what can and can't be funded. And there are some fairly extensive changes and some expansion of information to clarify what can and can't be funded with the new funding rules. So let's talk a little bit about what can be funded. First of all, they talked about what can be funded within the apprenticeship, and it was things like on-programme assessment, end assessment, that's the endpoint assessment, and certification, that's funded by the levy. And this is all funding that comes from the new employer levy. They also clarified that distance learning and online learning can be funded with the levy, but it's got to be as part of a blended learning approach. So what that means is that the apprenticeship can't just be all online learning. It's got to be some classroom, some mentoring, some online learning. It can't just all be e-learning. They also clarified that materials used in the delivery of the apprenticeship can be paid for by the levy. This is materials that would not normally be used beyond the lifespan of that particular apprenticeship. So for example, it might be admin costs associated with the delivery, such as teaching materials, lesson planning materials. They also clarified that the cost of returning the individual learner record, the ILR, can be paid for by the levy, and also that quality assurance can be paid for by the levy. So that ILR clarification is quite important, because a lot of new employers and employer providers who will be doing their own delivery are going to need an ILR system. They're going to need to return ILRs to the Skills Funding Agency on a monthly basis, so the levy can pay for the cost of those ILR returns. Funding is also available to retake some parts of the apprenticeship, for instance, mandatory qualifications and the endpoint assessment, but the Skills Funding Agency funding rules made it very clear that the retake of mandatory qualifications and the endpoint assessment can only be paid for out of the levy if additional learning has taken place. If no additional learning has taken place, then it can't be paid for by the levy. So with employers and providers, when you're negotiating that written legal agreement before you commence an apprenticeship, you need to make sure that you've got within that written legal agreement arrangements for retake of apprenticeship qualifications or retake of endpoint assessment. If you think that no additional learning is going to take place, you need to arrange with your employer to make sure that that can be paid for. So what else can be funded? Endpoint assessment, that all comes out of the negotiated price. What can't be paid for is enrolment, diagnostics at the beginning of an apprenticeship and registration. That all is not paid for out of the levy. Other things that cannot be paid for, as I mentioned earlier, are resits and repeats with no extra learning. What they also expanded on was capital purchases. So capital purchases, purchases such as IT, for example, buildings, land, that can't be paid for out of the levy. A capital purchase is something that might be used beyond the lifespan of the apprenticeship. So if you wanted to buy a computer for an apprentice, but you were going to use that computer with other apprentices or as part of your normal daily work beyond the lifespan of that apprenticeship, that can't be paid for. That's seen as a capital purchase. They also flagged that items such as recruitment, third-party costs, inductions, continuing professional development of staff that are delivering apprenticeships, that also cannot be paid for out of the levy. So there's quite an expansion there of the information about what can and can't be paid for, and if you are a provider or an employer provider, it's really worth your while going to those sections in the funding rules and reading what you can and can't pay for out of the levy. And finally, for endpoint assessment, they added in some new information, and that was that endpoint assessment should be approximately 20% of the cost of an apprenticeship, but a new piece of information is that it should be 20% of the negotiated cost. So if a provider and employer are negotiating over the cost of an apprenticeship, and the cost of that apprenticeship is lower than the actual band that the apprenticeship sits in, then the endpoint assessment should be 20% of the negotiated price. And that's a new bit of information, which is a change. Certainly worth thinking about when the provider or an employer provider is negotiating with their endpoint assessment organisation to make sure that actually the cost of endpoint assessment can be covered. Because if it's substantially more than 20% of the negotiated price, then it may well be that as an employer, they may need to pay more for the cost of endpoint assessment or more for the cost of the whole apprenticeship. So those are some of the changes that we've had within the funding rules. There are a few other bits and pieces, but those are really the most important ones. And I'm sure that some people may actually have questions about that, and I think we've got Kate online looking to see if we've got any questions coming through. And I'm happy to answer them, so if some of you want to fire questions online now, Kate will ask me and I'll see if I can actually answer them whilst we're here going live.
So I haven't got any questions at the moment. Paul, have you seen any come through? No questions yet. Brian,
no questions as yet.
Asked questions that you get when you're doing your road tours?
Commonly asked questions that we get when we're doing road tours. One of the most commonly asked questions I think we get when we're doing road tours is about qualifications which are not mandatory within the apprenticeship. And some of the new information within the funding rules is that the levy will pay for mandatory qualifications and qualifications that are specifically mentioned inside the actual standard. But it does say that the levy will not pay for non-mandatory qualifications, but it also mentions that the levy will not pay for licence to practice qualifications, even if they are specifically written into the apprenticeship standard. So that means if an apprenticeship standard has included a licence to practice for that apprentice to reach the gateway to take endpoint assessment, the levy cannot pay for that licence to practice. It has to be paid for over and above the cost of the apprenticeship standard. So the employer would need to be charged for that, or the employer and the provider would need to come to some sort of arrangement about the cost of that licence to practice, or the cost of a non-mandatory qualification. And that's the non-mandatory qualification, that's the certification and the accreditation and the assessment of that non-mandatory qualification. So that's a fairly regularly asked question, is what can and can't be paid for regarding licence to practice and qualifications.
So can people use their levy money with existing staff, or is it all brand new staff?
Well, levy money is there to pay staff that are actually delivering. What you can't use the levy money for is to recruit new staff. If you're recruiting new staff to deliver, you can't use it to do that, but you can use it to pay the wages of those staff that are delivering. Interestingly, it does clarify the cost of staffing inside the new funding rules. So, for example, if you are an employer provider and you've got managers who are mentoring the apprentice, the levy cannot pay any of their wages or contribute to the mentoring they're doing. It can actually only pay for the staff that are delivering the apprenticeship, the staff that are doing the actual teaching. So employer providers would have to be very clear about which staff are doing what when it comes to the delivery of apprenticeship, and track that and keep auditable evidence for the Skills Funding Agency, so they could see what the employer provider was spending their levy on and clarify that actually they are using the levy for the delivery of the apprenticeship.
And can your levy money be used for any age of apprentice, or does it have to be?
Yes, as from 1st of May, there are no restrictions on the age of the apprentice taking the apprenticeship. So you could have anyone from the age of 16 right up to the age of 65 or 70 or however old your workforce is. One thing that the new rules do make very clear is that there must be progression. So you can't use an apprenticeship just to confirm the learning of a current employee, for example, because you can offer apprenticeships to your current employees, but it must be to improve their skills, improve their knowledge and progress their career inside your organisation. So lots of employers out there are already planning how they'll use their apprenticeship levy to improve their in-house progression and grow the skills of their current staff, as well as new staff that they might be taking on to fill new roles.
And are there particular job types that can be used, or could it just fund any job that you wanted it to in a business?
You can do an apprenticeship with any member of staff for any apprenticeship standard or framework that's out there. So there are lists on the .gov website of all the current apprenticeship standards that are ready for delivery, and all the apprenticeship frameworks that are still being delivered. And if there's an apprenticeship standard or an apprenticeship framework that's available for delivery, you can deliver it to any member of your current staff, any new member of staff, of any age, according to what I said earlier. Obviously there's got to be new skills and learning that they're gaining to enable them to progress inside your organisation, or to enable a new recruit to learn to do their job effectively. Okay, I think that's all the questions we've had from everybody that's online. I hope that was useful, everybody. I'm sure we'll be doing more of these in the future, so thanks very much.